Well, since there's basically no real reporting being done related to coronavirus and very little real science being done, I thought this might be useful. A couple of weeks ago, I think I did a video saying that almost the only good data that we had was from the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which showed about a 1% death rate. That was an early version of coronavirus, as I mentioned in the previous video. Viruses like this tend to attenuate and develop less deadly forms over time. So now we have a little bit of data from a few countries. Strangely, the World Health Organization and the CDC here in the United States have done really no studies. They've had a month now to do studies to determine what the actual death rate is, how this virus spreads within the population, but for various reasons, they've done no science whatsoever. So you have to go to small entities which do these studies. Iceland has incredibly good data. They've tracked different versions of the virus. They've tested 10% of their total population, etc. Their total death rate amongst the people that were tested and confirmed to have coronavirus is 0.5% death rate, but they've only tested 10% of their population. The actual infected population in Iceland might be maybe double that. So maybe a 0.25% death rate is the actual death rate. And these are really rough estimates because, as I said, almost no one is doing real science. It takes a small country of 300,000 people to develop the best data on this disease, whereas the World Health Organization, the CDC, people with billions of dollars, don't do any good science. The Faroe Islands is one of the other small entities that's tested a high percentage of its population. And by testing a large percentage of their population, they found almost 200 cases, 0 deaths. So again, less than 0.5% death rate. When I made a video on coronavirus a few weeks ago, I mentioned that it does appear to be very dangerous and that it is reasonable to take rather drastic measures to slow its spread. And that's still the case. If 0.25% of the people who catch it are dying, it's maybe twice as dangerous as a bad flu. And it also spreads much more quickly than a bad flu. So it's perfectly reasonable to try to slow the spread. At this point, however, bad science is either accidentally or in some cases purposefully occurring in order to make this look worse than it is. First of all, the Diamond Princess cruise ship, the only good data before, is now being subverted to a degree, it seems. I don't have endless hours to research this, but the deaths on the Diamond Princess cruise ship, it stood at about 1%, and then it began climbing, and it appears that they've added in the deaths from all the cruise ships into the Diamond Princess data without upping the number of people who were tested positive on the Diamond Princess. So now it makes it look like 1.5% of the people on that cruise ship who had coronavirus died, when in reality it was about 1%. And as I mentioned, that was a very elderly population, so it would seem reasonable that in a normal country's population, maybe 0.25% is a more reasonable estimate, and that's what the little bit of good data, as I said, that we have from Iceland or the Faroe Islands is indicating. None of the large entities like the WHO or the CDC seem to have any interest in finding good data on this. They seem to be more interested in just pushing the narrative that this is very dangerous. And I'll get into that in a minute. There were a couple of studies that were planned as far back as several weeks ago in the United States by independent entities, of course not by the CDC. There were a few professors at Stanford doctors at Stanford who felt that the risks were greatly overblown, and they were doing an antibody study to determine what percent of the general population had contracted coronavirus. And this similar study was being done by a small company in Telluride, Colorado. These were the only good studies that would have shown us what percent of the population has already had coronavirus, and then we would be able to calculate exactly, or at least have a better estimate of how dangerous this disease is. The Telluride study came back immediately and within a few days with 2 days worth of data. It showed that about 1 to 2% of the population in that area had already had coronavirus. And at that time, I don't know if there had been a single death. So that this would have calculated again into a very low death rate from coronavirus. As soon as those 2 days worth of study data came out, the study was basically closed down, and there's been no word since for weeks now. Same thing happened with the Stanford study that was occurring around San Francisco area. The data was supposed to come back very quickly, and it just hasn't come back at all. And there's been no word as to why that study closed down. Instead, the CDC talks about doing antibody studies, but it's going to take many months. So I think at this point, yeah, and also if you watch the media frenzy surrounding coronavirus, you can also see that a narrative is clearly being pushed that this is a very dangerous disease and we need to keep everything closed down. Originally, the media and the doctors that are put out as the spokespeople for the government, originally these people were saying that we needed to keep everything closed down because we needed to flatten the curve and that hospital systems would be overwhelmed. And that was perfectly reasonable. I mean, this is a relatively dangerous version of the common cold. It spreads very quickly, and in places like New York or Los Angeles, you could overwhelm the hospital system, and it did appear to happen in New York. At this point, however, no more hospital systems are being overwhelmed, and there are many countries that didn't initiate complete shutdowns of the entire country where the hospital systems were not overwhelmed. So there's no real science behind an entire shutdown of a country for an unspecified period of time. Plenty of countries did partial mitigation measures, and things went fine and no systems became overwhelmed. If you believe that the disease will continue to be as dangerous as it ever was, then everybody's going to eventually get this, and the only purpose for shutting down a country would be to limit the initial influx of people that overwhelm hospitals, which hasn't occurred. So from the media's initial narrative, there is no logic behind a continued shutdown, really. However, there's a reason for these shutdowns, and it's very similar to what happened in 2008. Trillions of dollars have been printed and handed to large banks, basically, and that'll filter first into large corporations. And when they did this in 2008, the first thing that happens is when you print $1 trillion, it's the same as counterfeiting. It robs everyone else. When you call it counterfeiting, you recognize, oh, that robs people who hold money of their value, but when you call it quantitative easing or whatever they're going to call it this time around, then everybody just seems okay with it. When you printed $2 trillion, you increased the total supply of US dollars by 15% or so, and so you robbed everyone who had savings or retirement of about 15% of all of their money. And then a second thing will occur, because this money will be handed to the large banks, and it will filter first to the large corporations, the majority of it. There'll be a little bit of a pittance paid out to keep the proletariat happy, but basically it's going to go to large banks and the large corporations. And when all the small entities are going bankrupt due to the shutdown, the large entities are going to be able to buy up. With this cheap credit, they're going to be able to buy up all the small entities. Same thing happened in 2008. Restaurants will be horribly hit. I can't imagine how independent restaurants are going to continue to run, and who's going to step into that void. Large restaurant chains will survive because they have cheap credit. You'll see this in the oil industry. Any kind of small competitive oil exploration company will go bankrupt, and the Exxons who have access to cheap credit are going to buy them all up and consolidate their already existing basic monopolies. So this was extremely valuable for banks and for large monopolistic corporations, and that's part of why this narrative keeps getting pushed that we have to keep everything closed down. I'm not saying that's the only reason. Large entities like the CDC and the WHO are just naturally bureaucratic and inefficient. So a lot of this, and the media also, when you have a consolidation of the media, they just naturally become inefficient at really reporting anything well. However, there's also the angle that this benefits wealthy people, and that's why it continues on. Again, this was a really sloppy video. I haven't had immense time to research these topics. I just thought that the little bit of decent scientific data that has come out from small independent entities was worth reporting, because it's not going to get reported anywhere else. Of course, it's not going to get reported on YouTube either, because we also have a search engine monopoly with Google, and any type of independent reporting there is also minimized, and everything that you see is going to be from a large news network. Lastly, yes, this all looks really bad, so what do you do about it? Just like in 2008, there's not much you can do about it. They're going to print trillions of dollars and hand it to large oligarchs and large banks. You can't do anything about it. You can't do much about them bankrupting you and taxing you to death. One thing you can temporarily do, though, is during deleveraging events like this, temporarily hard assets become particularly cheap. And if you have any cash, now it's a particularly good time to buy any type of hard asset before we start another round of inflation, as these trillions of dollars and then trillions more dollars due to fractional reserve lending hit the economy. You're going to see, just like after 2008, continued extremely high inflation. And now's a brief window of time, just like in 2008, when you can buy assets cheaply. As I always say, hard assets are precious metals, real estate, that type of thing. You may have looked and seen that, oh, well, hard assets, I would like to buy gold or platinum or whatnot, but I can't find it anywhere, at least nowhere near the supposed spot price. This is a whole nother long topic I may make a video on in the future. The reason you can't find precious metals at the spot price is that the COMEX and the NYMEX are basically in default, and they've been in default for 6 or 7 years in varying stages of default. And no one has reported this. Even the libertarian gold bug types aren't really aware of this, because no one takes delivery from COMEX and NYMEX. I'll do a video on this probably at some point in the future. It's a really long topic, but there's an effective default by the NYMEX. Depositories are required to ensure delivery, and they have abrogated that responsibility. And the NYMEX is not holding them to their obligation, and therefore no one can take delivery at spot price. What do you do about that? You basically realize that the true price of precious metal is whatever it is from an actual dealer. Even if you went to Johnson Matthey, a large monopolistic refiners and miners, you won't be able to buy these metals, because they know that's not the spot price either. They will only promise these prices to their long-term industrial customers. If you had a business, for example, and you wanted to take delivery of thousands of ounces of platinum at spot price, Johnson Matthey would tell you, no, we can't sell it to you. So what can you do about this? Recognize the actual spot price is actually higher. It's 10-20% above what's quoted. One thing you can do, though, is to buy a paper contract at the supposed current spot price and wait for the situation to normalize, because eventually the spot price and the actual price will come back together once the markets settle down. And most likely the spot price will rise up to what the actual price is. So if you're willing to take the counterparty risk of buying an ETF or a futures contract, you can just hold it and wait for that spot price, that paper price, to rise up to the actual price. This is what happened in 2008. You couldn't find precious metal in 2008 anywhere near the quoted spot price, but if you bought an ETF or a futures contract, it eventually rose up to meet the spot price, because they can't stay in obvious default forever. There is a counterparty risk, but I would say if you're just going to hold a paper contract for 6 months or so, it's probably not a huge risk. Sorry again that this was a really long, convoluted, and sloppy video. I just don't have time to put together great videos. I've got a lot of really interesting topics planned in the future, and I've been planning it for years and just haven't gotten around to it. Sorry about that. I will get to making better videos eventually.